Hello, welcome to Central Nervous System Part 2. Check to see if my pen works. We're going to look at the motor areas of the cerebral cortex in this video. So this cartoon says that there's 3 functional areas of the cerebral cortex. And so we're looking at a lateral view of the left cerebral hemisphere. And it shows you with this key of this cartoon, this color, which is, I don't know, is that salmon? I'm not sure. Anyway, so that's all of this is the motor association cortex. And then the purple stuff is the primary sensory cortex. So all of this. And I'll be impressed if you know the region that the primary sensory cortex lives in. If you said the post-central gyrus, you would be right. And then from that, logically, it would follow that the primary motor cortex here lives in the precentral gyrus. So this whole thing is this whole red thing is the precentral gyrus, and that's where the primary motor cortex is. And then in the rear, or you have this blue. This is the sensory association cortex. And then all this kind of, I don't know if that's like lavender, but that's all multimodal association cortex. So let's recap. So you have a primary motor cortex and a motor association cortex. So that obviously deals with motor functions. So in other words, like contracting a skeletal muscle. And then you have a primary sensory cortex and a sensory association cortex. So that's where this area of the brain is where you sense things. Like,
sorry, I missed that.
I don't know why my phone keeps thinking I'm asking it a question. Well, maybe it just wants to learn more science. So let's take a look. So the motor areas of the cortex control voluntary movement. So that would be voluntary movement of your skeletal muscle, for example. The primary, so this one with a degree sign up here means primary. So the primary sensory cortex that lives in the post-central gyrus, that's where you get conscious awareness of sensation. So for example, your sense of smell and taste, that's where you would receive that information consciously. So you'd be aware that you're smelling something or tasting something in this area. And then the association areas of the cortex, they just integrate all diverse information. So for example, you might smell something, you'll have that sense of smell, but then that information could be integrated with a memory that lives somewhere else in the brain, in the hippocampus. And the association areas of the brain would link those two, smell to a memory, for example. But your conscious behavior involves the entire cortex. So remember the cortex, you can't see it in this cartoon, but remember the cortex is just that really thin, about 1/8 of an inch of gray matter on the surface of the brain. Okay, so same cartoon, lateral view, left cerebral hemisphere. And now it gives you the key down here, the primary motor cortex. So we talked about this. Here's the primary motor cortex. This guy's the primary sensory cortex. And then you have the motor association cortex here and the sensory association cortex here. So there's 4 generalizations about the functional areas of the cerebral cortex that you can make. So there's 4 generalizations. The first generalization about the functional areas of the cerebral cortex is that there are 3 kinds of functional areas. There's a motor functional area, a sensory functional area, and then an association area. That is the 3rd kind of functional area, performs a function. Ooh, why did number 4 come up? Oh well, let's find number 2. There it is. Each cerebral hemisphere and its functional area is concerned with the contralateral side of the body. So remember, contralateral just means on the opposite side of the body. So for example, the motor, the primary motor cortex here is in the left cerebral hemisphere, would be associated with motor patterns on the right cerebral hemisphere, or the right side of the body, actually. And then all these functional areas of the cerebral cortex have a division of labor between the two cerebral hemispheres. So, for example, language function is in your left hemisphere. And I think we have a cartoon that shows all the different areas that are in each hemisphere. But even though you can carve these up and you can say language is on the left hemisphere, no functional area acts alone, so everything is interconnected. So here's the same cartoon that we've been looking at. Again, the primary motor cortex lives in the precentral gyrus, and then the primary sensory cortex lives in the postcentral gyrus. But let's look at the motor areas of the cortex. So primary motor cortex, here's the premotor cortex, and then within that is this area called the frontal eye field. So that's for vision, and then this area with dashed lines, that's called Broca's area, and that's involved with sound production. And I think I have more on Broca's area in a minute in this video. So let's look at the primary somatic motor cortex. So, and this is a new cartoon. So I pointed out here, this is the central sulcus. So if you find the central sulcus, you can find the precentral gyrus. If you can find the precentral gyrus, then you have found the primary motor cortex. And they call it the primary somatic motor cortex because it sends information out to skeletal muscle. So somatic, if you see the word somatic, that's associated with skeletal muscle, joints, and the skin. And you can see there's a neuron traveling from the primary motor cortex, goes down here to the spinal cord, and then it synapses with another neuron, and then that neuron goes out to some muscle cells and the neuromuscular junction, and you get contraction of skeletal muscle. Same for this neuron at the top of the cartoon. So in the precentral gyrus of the cerebral cortex, you have a type of motor neuron called an upper motor neuron. So the red neuron that goes from the cortex down into the spinal cord, that's an upper motor neuron. And then the black neuron that comes out of the spinal cord, that's a lower motor neuron. And this area, this primary somatic motor cortex, carries out conscious control of precise, skilled, and voluntary movement. So for example, playing the piano or hitting a tennis ball. Okay, this is hilarious. I love these homunculi. So this is a motor homunculi, and it looks really freaky. But what it is, it's an upside down map representing the relative motor innervation of body regions. So, for example, if we come over here to this part of the cartoon, let's take a look. So this red stuff, this is all cerebral cortex, and it's gray matter lives there. And then this would be a coronal section through the brain. Oh yeah, sorry, I forgot. We've got this picture up here. So we've got posterior brain, anterior brain. They do a frontal section. It looks like they're cutting right down the center of the central sulcus, and then they're looking at the motor cortex, the primary motor cortex that lives in the precentral gyrus. And then you can see this face, this guy's face. So what it's showing you, it's kind of out of morphological range of a of a normal face. Like this is out. This is not, your hands aren't normally this huge, and then your shoulder, arm, elbow, and wrist are usually not that tiny. But what it's showing is the amount of innervation, so neurons going to the face. So this is kind of interesting. As humans, you know, we use speech. That's kind of important for us. So there's a lot of information with the lips and jaw. Your fingers are very sensitive. That's why the hand is so big, because there's a lot of motor neurons going to your fingers. That's part of being human too, is that our amazing finger dexterity. There are less motor neurons relatively going to your shoulder, arm, elbow, and wrist, your trunk and hip, your knee and toes. So most of your motor neurons are relatively are going to the bigger parts on this motor homunculus. And then it shows what it looks like too over here, this guy, homunculus. Take me to your leader. That is kind of creepy, but kind of funny. Okay, we're still in the functional motor areas of the cerebral cortex. So now we're at the premotor cortex. So that's this kind of, I don't know what color that is, kind of a burnt orange color. So the red is the primary motor cortex, and then you have the premotor cortex. And what does the premotor cortex do? It plans your conscious control of precise, skilled, voluntary movement. So the premotor cortex does the planning. So it maps out a plan for conscious control of your precise movement. The premotor cortex is involved with learned, repetitious, and pattern motor skills. The premotor cortex will select a specific movement or sequence of movements from all the movements that it knows about, just for that particular movement that you've chosen to do. So for example, you know, throw a bowling ball down the lane. Premotor cortex will make that plan, and then with other motor areas execute the plan. So the third part of the motor areas of the cortex, that's the frontal eye field. Obviously that controls voluntary movement of your eyes. Now, if you can do voluntary movement of your eyes, what type of muscle are you using? Are you using smooth muscle, skeletal muscle, or cardiac muscle to voluntarily move your eyes in that direction or that direction? If you said skeletal muscle, you would be right. And here's a cartoon of all the skeletal muscles that you have conscious control over when you're moving your eyes. So there's 6 of these extrinsic eye muscles. This is a lateral view of the right eye. So this stuff, you can probably tell this is all bone here. And then these are all the muscles. And you don't have to know them for this test, but when we do special senses in the eye, you'll have to memorize all these muscles. But I just wanted to show you all the complexity of the muscle structures that move your eyeball. Okay, so within the premotor cortex, there is an area that is involved in motors, the motor component of your speech, and that's called Broca's area. So this outlined area here, that's a motor speech area. Broca's area is involved with speaking language. So if you have a stroke in this area, you wouldn't be able to speak. So this sends action potentials out to muscles in your face and throat that allow you to speak words. That's Broca's area. So it's a motor speech area. It also directs the muscles of the tongue, because obviously you need your tongue to form coherent speech. Usually Broca's area is present in only one hemisphere. So, and that's usually the left hemisphere.